Hello, welcome to this episode of Lasting Transformation. My name's Alan Parry and I'm the author of How to Remove Trauma Response, a memory reconsolidation guidebook for therapists and coaches. And what I want to look at today in this particular episode is something that I think of as the invisible twin framework. So I'm going to be looking at, first of all, the idea that the problem isn't the problem. Second, I want to look at the invisible twin framework itself. And thirdly, I want to get to the key question that drives transformation itself. So I'm sure you all know and have experienced those sessions where everything just lands and something just genuinely shifts in the session. You can feel it in the room, the client feels it, and real genuine change has happened, real transformational change. You're not just managing the problem here, but the problem has gone. And you can have a session and you feel that shift where something that the client really held as fundamentally true has now been discarded. And you'll know what it's like to leave those sessions because it feels great. You feel really clear. You feel really certain. It's like, this is exactly why you do this work. And then on the other hand are the other sessions. And in those sessions, you're working hard, just like before. You're using everything you know. You're using all your skills, your approaches, your intuition. You're even using the same kind of tools and techniques and approaches that you used in that other session where everything shifted. But this time nothing moves. And you leave those sessions very differently. You leave feeling tired, maybe a bit frustrated with yourself, second guessing, that imposter syndrome kicks in, running through what you could have done differently, what might you do differently next time. But also really being very aware of the gap between these two sessions, particularly if you've been doing very similar work yourself and getting such different results. And so if that gap feels familiar, the hit and miss of it, the sessions where you're not quite sure what's happening, the sessions where you're thinking, well, what do I do now? This episode is for you because the problem is not your skill level. It's simply that you were never taught this mechanism. You were never given the map. And a big part of that is because in therapy schools, it's still not really taught. I wasn't taught it. And I've told the story many times now about how I discovered memory reconsolidation pretty much entirely by chance. This thing that's revolutionized both my personal life, my inner world, but also my professional capabilities. I found out about it by chance, which of course is the very reason I wrote the book, because it's far too important for anyone to learn this by chance. But I'm a good example that we weren't taught this. Now, in terms of my own abilities were no different before I knew this and afterwards. It's just that I had finally been taught the mechanism. I was able to then construct a map based on what the neuroscience tells us about what the brain needs in order to generate transformational change. So like I say, in this episode, I'm going to look at three things. I'm going to look at this sense of the problem is not the problem, which sounds odd, but I'll go into it in a moment. Secondly, the invisible twin framework that I've created that I want to share with you. And then finally, the key question that we have to get to if we're really going to understand what keeps the problem alive. So the first thing I want to look at is what the training missed. This sense that I said a moment ago that the problem isn't the problem. When I look at clinical training and when I think of my own clinical training, a lot of it teaches us to put a lot of focus on the presenting problem, to kind of categorize it, to name it, for some even to go to the DSM-5 and find the disorder that matches it and then treat it. And there's a fundamental flaw in all of that from my perspective, which is the idea that if only we can really understand the problem so well that we can categorize it accurately, that is then going to lead us to the solution, because the solution and the problem are kind of different sides of the same coin. And the big flaw is also that if only we could get to a point where we can categorize the problem correctly, we'll know exactly what to do with it. Because once we know something is depression, well, there is a set criteria or protocol that we use with all people who are struggling with what we've categorized as depression. Same with anxiety. If someone is struggling with what we've categorized as anxiety, well, then we know what steps to apply to those people. And if someone's coming in with low self-esteem, then we know what steps to implement with those people. And it's like, as long as we can put people in the right box, we know how to work with the thing that they have. And I think it's a big flaw because it misunderstands the sense that maybe people are suffering that presenting problem for a different reason. And that's what I'm going to come into. So what tends to happen then from that standpoint of how a lot of clinical training is set up is that, I don't know, maybe a client does come in with anxiety, and so we'll focus on the anxiety. What are the triggers? And then we'll build the strategies and we'll try and reduce the anxiety. And so the entire focus, the whole picture is the anxiety, is the problem. The problem becomes the thing that we're focused on. And the problem with that is that we're not stopping to ask, well, what's behind this problem? What's holding it in place? It's almost as if we're taught that getting deep on the problem in order that we can reduce it, that is the work. But here's what I've come to believe. And this is what the neuroscience, I think, of memory consolidation anyhow guides us to. But also after watching these same patterns play out across hundreds of sessions of my own, the thing that I've come to believe is this: the problem is not the problem. Now that probably sounds like a strange thing to say. The problem is not the problem. So what I mean by that is, let's say there's a fire alarm going off. If a fire alarm is going off, that will get in the way of life. That will be very, very annoying indeed. But the key to solving the problem of the fire alarm ringing so loudly actually has very little to do with the fire alarm. And so this old style traditional way of doing the work, where we're looking to reduce the impact of the fire alarm, would lead us to stay very tightly tied to the fire alarm itself. Like, is there a volume switch on the fire alarm? Is there any way that, given that it's ringing, we could make it ring less loud? Could we put ear mufflers on? But in actual fact, when I say the problem isn't the problem, the inconvenience of the fire alarm going off is not really anything to do with the fire alarm. And the way that you actually solve the problem of the fire alarm is not to get more and more focused on the fire alarm itself, but to actually find the fire. You see, if you find the fire and you put the fire out, guess what happens? The fire alarm stops of its own accord. And so it's only when you understand the function, only when you understand What is ensuring that the fire alarm is ringing? That you can actually get to a point where the fire alarm stops. Now, the answer to that wasn't to be working on the fire alarm. And in fact, it would have been really quite dangerous just to find some way of flipping a switch and turning the fire alarm off while the fire keeps raging. No, the answer, the real solution to the problem, had very little to do with the problem itself. The solution to the problem was to find the fire, because it was the fire that was keeping the fire alarm ringing. Now, in exactly the same way, when our clinical training has pushed us and invited us to get really, really focused on the presenting problem and get really interested in the anxiety or the depression or the low self-esteem or whatever it is, we're actually missing the thing that is really important when it comes to transformational change. Something in that person's system is creating that problem for a really good reason. And until we know what that is, then we'll be working against our client's own internal system. So the second point I want to come to is to share with you then about the invisible twin framework. Now, the way I see this is whenever a client comes in with a problem, they also bring with them this twin, this invisible twin initially. And so that's a name I've given it. I call it the invisible twin. And basically what that means is that the client will come with a problem like anxiety or low confidence or depression or whatever. And they'll say, look, I've got this problem. I want to get rid of it. And I want something else instead. And they really sincerely believe that. They do. That's why they're there. They're sick of the anxiety. They're sick of the self-loathing. They're sick of having low confidence or depression. And so they will come to us and say, I've got this problem. I want to be rid of it. And it's true. They do. But the invisible twin is the one that they bring with them. And the invisible twin is a part of their own inner system that is actually producing that very problem on purpose. And it's doing so because from the invisible twin's worldview, from its old emotional learning, it believes that something worse would happen if it stopped. So when we think of problems, we think that something is going wrong. We think that there is a malfunction here that is happening, but actually it's not. It's working perfectly and it will make sense. And so the invisible twin is responding in this way out of a sense of protection. Now it'll have a modus operandi, it will do a specific job. If your client has anxiety, then its specific job is to make them feel anxious. If they feel pessimistic and depressed, its job will be to make your client pessimistic and depressed. It'll have a specific job. It'll have a specific strategy. And it will be doing that strategy for some really good functional reason. Now, the belief behind it, the emotional learning behind it might be outdated. But nonetheless, from this invisible twin's point of view, this will make sense. And this is protective. And this is actually a job that it's doing to ensure that the client isn't simply swapping the problem that they have for an even worse problem. So if you take anxiety, the conventional frame is, this is a dysregulated nervous system, so they need calming, they need soothing, which is kind of a counteractive thing. But the invisible twin frame basically says, why does this anxiety make sense? Why is the invisible twin believing that it's essential to make this person anxious and to give them all these anxious feelings and anxious thoughts? Why does the invisible twin think that that's essential? What does that particular act from the standpoint of the invisible twin, keep the client safe from? And what would be the catastrophe, the apocalypse that would occur if the invisible twin no longer did its job? And so that question, how does this make sense? What would be the catastrophe without it, is where the real work begins. And you'll notice we're no longer actually looking at the problem. In fact, this switch of focus towards the invisible twin, this assumption that it makes sense and the invisible twin believes it is essential, this switch of focus has now taken us away from the problem entirely. Just like before, we needed to switch our focus away from the ringing bell of the fire alarm in order to find why it made sense that the fire alarm was actually ringing. Well, because there was a fire. So this is a part that is working really hard to protect your client from something. It's something there that is doing a job for a good reason. And so when we think of this as an invisible twin focus, we're now moving our attention to where transformation can really happen. Because now we can start discovering and finding out what the underlying reason is why the invisible twin, what the emotional learning that the twin has that is keeping the problem alive. Because after all, once that is updated, the problem, like the fire alarm earlier, will simply cease. So we've looked at two things. The first one we've looked is what the training missed, that sense that clinical training often teaches us to stay focused on the presenting problem, and that actually the problem is not the problem, and we use that metaphor of the fire alarm. We've just seen a different way of moving your focus towards an invisible twin framework. That sure, the client wants this to change, but the invisible twin is actually working really hard to maintain the problem and doesn't want the change. Why? For a really good reason. And now I want to get to the key question here. And the key question is always, why is this happening? And I don't mean, why does this person have anxiety or depression or low self-esteem, but really, what would be the catastrophe that ensues about not having it? That for me is the key question. If you actually got what you wanted, and so we're no longer, say, depressed or no longer anxious, and you are living this different life now, what would be the catastrophe that your invisible twin thinks is going to happen? And so that is the key question here. What would be so bad about not having it? So I find it really useful to map the twin's modus operandi precisely. Like, what does the twin do? What does it do the moment that the client connects to this trigger? So if a client says, I'm always anxious, for instance, I'm always anxious in a public situation where I have to give a talk. Why does what happens here? What does the invisible twin do to ensure that the client feels a certain way or thinks a certain way? So it might be, makes the client's heart race faster, makes their palms sweaty. It might be that they have certain thoughts, oh, I'm going to mess this up or whatever, all of which is designed to be aversive, all of which is designed by the invisible twin as a strategy to get the client away from that situation. And so it's really interesting to map that strategy to understand that the problem is actually the invisible twin doing its thing to get the client to stop and move in the opposite direction. But like I say, the key question is, from the invisible twin's point of view, if it couldn't do that, what would be so bad that would be a set of consequences that would befall your client if the invisible twin couldn't stop you from doing that talk in front of everyone? or if the invisible twin couldn't ensure that you had those anxious feelings, or whatever it happens to be. Because once you know the job of the invisible twin, you will really start to understand what needs to be updated using memory consolidation, what needs to be activated and mismatched in order to create the transformation. You see, until we know that, we're going to be limited to only being able to create transformation almost inadvertently, because we're not deliberately matching the worldview of the invisible twin. We haven't discovered what that worldview is. And until we know what that emotional learning is, we can't activate and mismatch it. And if we don't do that, the brain mechanism of memory consolidation simply doesn't happen. And so those hit and miss moments that I spoke of at the beginning, this is why they happen. Because unless we have the roadmap that moves us away from the problem towards the invisible twin and gets us really curious about the emotional learning that makes the reproduction of this problem absolutely essential, until we know that, we just can't mismatch it. Not on purpose anyway. We might do it by accident, but we can't do that on purpose unless we are connected to what that worldview is. So let's close then. We've seen three things here, haven't we? We've seen that, first of all, the clinical training thinks that the important thing is the problem and how to mitigate the problem. When does it show up? What are the triggers so that we can build strategies to reduce it? But the key thing is to understand that the problem isn't the problem. The best way to stop a fire alarm is to put out the fire. And then we looked at the alternative framework that I'm inviting you to connect to, which is the invisible twin framework, that when a client comes into a session, they know what they want. I want rid of this thing. But they also bring in an invisible twin that is actually working hard to keep that thing alive and present. And then we moved on to the third point, which is the key question is, so why does that make sense? And more crucially, why is it essential from the twins' point of view? What would be so bad about the client no longer having this problem? What is the price that they would pay? What are the costs that would befall them? And when you understand that, you understand the prediction of danger that motivates the invisible twin to keep that unwanted problem alive all along. So before you try to move past any presenting problem, or before you start digging deeper into a presenting problem, before you start thinking that understanding the problem more is what's going to get you to a solution, step aside, change your focus, find the twin, ask what job it's doing and what it's protecting, because when you know that and you're able to have those massive aha moments with clients, then you will actually feel as though your sessions have direction. You will know in your bones that you're not guessing anymore and you're working with a framework that is leading you step by step towards reconsolidation and transformation. And that's what that calm confidence in the room actually feels like. Now, if you're curious about finding out more about how to do this, that's what the Memory Consolidation Elite Coaching Academy is for. It's for therapists and coaches to become the most effective therapist and coach that you can be, and become the practitioner that everyone wants to work with, because you're able to achieve consistent transformations with and for your clients. So if you're curious how to delve deep and you'd like to become that practitioner who knows how to consistently get these results, then you can find out more by going to freshtherapists.com. That's plural, freshtherapists.com coaching, and you'll find out more about the Coaching Academy there. If you want to find out the other tools that are available to you and my various articles and so on, then you can go to freshtherapists.com. And if you'd like to work with me directly, one-to-one, either on a coaching for your own professional development, or if there's a change in your own life that you'd like to make using these kind of frameworks, then you can find me at alanparry.com. Now remember, Alan is spelled unusually ALUN, so that's alanparry.com. Other than that, thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.